Welcome to a weekly YouTube series that's kind of become bi-weekly this summer. I'm Christine, the owner of Rithful Media, and I'm talking today about very practical tips for show hosts. We've had some bigger picture conversations lately on the series, but today I'm just talking about when you're really in the middle of being a show host on a podcast or YouTube show, or maybe even moderating or Q&Aing in a live stage environment. When is it a good idea to go off script? And when is it a good idea to stay on script? And this is totally relevant if you're interviewing. I'm not going to get into like speaking solo on stage. Obviously, it's relevant there too, but I'm just going to specifically talk to you today if you're a show host or a moderator or someone who's frequently interviewing or dialoguing with people in either a recorded format or live. And obviously, in this world, you would have prepared notes, you would have questions, you would have background, you would have an idea of where you're taking the conversation. And the question I get frequently from clients and when we're shooting or recording is like, when is it okay to go off script? Like sometimes we have this conversation after recording, we're kind of debriefing about the opportunity that they had and whether they took it or not. Sometimes we're doing it beforehand when we're doing kind of show host coaching and prepping. So this is a totally practical tips video, and hopefully it'll be relevant to you regardless of what kind of show hosting you're doing. In podcasting, we'll just use that as the example. So often, obviously, over the last 20 years, this medium has been focused on interviews, not all the time. But in the podcast version of interviewing someone, a guest, a good show host, of course, will have prepared ahead of time and looked up their background and their bio and what they're working on, what they're known for. Obviously have maybe their talking points provided from the guest of maybe the key things they're looking to communicate about, whether they have a book coming out or they're promoting some new project. So there's all that basic stuff that you would expect, right? Whether the research team or the production team has done that and prepped the show host, or whether the show host has done that themselves. There's kind of an understanding for show hosts that they will enter an interview with some prep, right? They'll have questions, they'll have ideas of where they want it to go. And one of the best things you can do to be prepared for going off script is to have a conversation with your guest before you start recording. And just say, hey, whether you sent them the questions ahead of time or not, you have a quick conversation before you start recording, check in and just say, here's what I think we're going to cover. Is there anything here that I'm missing that's really interesting or valuable that you want to share on, the topic that we're talking about today? So you can do a good amount of prep ahead of time, even in just a short 5-minute conversation, to really understand what your guest is open to talking about, what they're enthused about talking about, which obviously creates the best content when they're invested and interested in talking about a certain topic. So definitely do all of that. And then let's say you're in the middle of the interview and your guest says something really intriguing that maybe you weren't expecting. Maybe they became more vulnerable than you were expecting. Maybe they just shared pieces of information that you didn't know they were going to share. Like there was more to the story and you didn't know. Or maybe they're telling a story for the first time that you weren't expecting. There's always a moment for a show host when that happens where they're like, oh, should I go off script? And should I just like follow this train of thought or this story or this experience? Or should I stick to my script, not go on a tangent? There's risk involved with like going over there. There might be gold, but there might be disaster. And do I stick to my script, or do I go off and follow that lead, which might be like the most interesting conversation we could have? So I'm going to just give some practical tips from a producer's point of view, having been there for many of these moments. And I've seen many different show hosts kind of navigate it. And there's a few things that I think will kind of serve you well, no matter what environment you're in, to make this decision. One is based on your experience of your guest, whether you've known them a long time or you just met them, you've had a ton of time to talk and prep or not very much at all. Whatever information you do have, whatever your context is, think about whether this person is savvy enough, and that's not a judgment, it's just like, there's context here. Are they savvy enough to go off script with you and continue to speak in the same kind of polished, digestible cadence? What I mean by that, I'm not trying to like use a bunch of jargon. What I mean that is sometimes when you're talking to a great guest and they've got all their talking points and they've done a bunch of media interviews, they can really speak very well and clearly, and they've got a lot of practice speaking on the topics you're covering. If you go off script and you go down to another place neither one of you are anticipating, there's a chance, people are human, that they might become much less eloquent and they might just start to have to think a lot or pause or stumble or gauge. They may not be prepped to talk about that. And so whatever context you have, whatever experience you have with this person, one of the best things you can do before you go off script with them is be like, can they go there with me and still speak in the same format? Because if you go over there and it ends up being really cool, but they're kind of having a hard time articulating, it doesn't make them look good. So even if your editor does a ton of cleanup and post-production, it's either going to be time intensive and expensive to get that edit, or it just might not be possible. And I don't want you to be tempted to kind of cobble something together that really doesn't make your guest look their best, even if they said something really interesting. One of the best things you can do as a show host is make your guest look good. That's good for everyone, but it's also just like your job, make your guest look good. And so you need to gauge before you go off script with them. You might know, you might be like, this person is like such a good conversationalist, such a good storyteller. They've clearly like had a ton of media training. Let's go there. I know that they're going to be fine. Or you might realize like, I think they're really good at talking on their trained media points, but I think if I go into this more personal story, or if I take them over here, they might not be ready for that. So that's the first question. Like, how prepared is your guest to speak in the same quality if you go off script? Another question and quick gauge to ask yourself before you go off script is, if we follow this thread that I wasn't expecting, we'll have time to cover the essentials. And this is like kind of a fine line, because you don't want to be married to your pre-prepared script in case something really much better comes along. But if you absolutely know, because you chatted with your guest beforehand, we need to make sure to cover X, Y, and Z because that's part of their promotion plan, or their, publicist needs them to hit these main points, and that's going to take like at least 10 minutes. If you don't have time in the time that you have together to go off into this unscripted tangent and cover the other stuff, like, don't do it. Because again, you're a professional. Like, you need to cover what you agreed upon, and it's your job as the show host to be the kind of timekeeper. And if you run out of time to cover like the thing you were supposed to talk about, that your entire audience will be left hanging if you don't cover like the big thing they would have wanted to know about this person. That's kind of a miss. So you need to think about how ready they are to go off topic and speak well about it. You need to think about like, how much time bandwidth do you have to do that? And let's say both of those are a yes, like yes and yes. Then it can be a really, really cool opportunity, because some of the best stuff happens unscripted if someone's prepared and you have the bandwidth and time. The other thing to consider when you go off script and you're like, hey, tell me more about this. I didn't even know that this was part of the story. I want you to keep finding ways to bring it back to the original topic. So even if you go off into this interesting place you didn't know was going to happen, the best show host will then still relate that and bring that back to the main topic and weave it back into kind of the main frame when you come back. So while you're doing that, if you do go off script and explore, just make sure to be listening for ways to bring it back to the main event or the topic, whether that's a live audience or an on-demand audience like a podcast. It's your job to like weave it all together. So some things can be done in editing, but not everything. So your job as the show host is still to make sure that there's that through line. Now, there are a couple of times where I would recommend not going off script, even if there's like, this person's ready and prepared. We have time. I think I can figure out how to bring it back to the main thing. There are some topics that are simply inappropriate or too sensitive to cover in the platform that you're on. And even if you know it would be like profound and deep, sometimes it's simply inappropriate to go there. If, let's say, for an example, let's say you work in the tech sector, you're interviewing this, super interesting tech founder about how to disrupt, software as a service and in this niche of healthcare. I'm just like making this up. That's the conversation that the audience is ready and signed up for. And let's say during the conversation, you discover this incredibly personal story of why this founder got into it because, the cancer with his mom, da 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 da. And then you realize there's something much more personal and interesting and powerful there. It still might not be the best venue to go have that conversation. Because if the audience is expecting like some interesting business advice, and then there's this like 10-minute deeply emotional story about whatever that's really too far afield, it can kind of throw off the audience to have a story like that delivered to them in a vehicle they weren't expecting. And as a show host, you're literally like the curator of the whole experience. And so even if it could be amazing, it just might not be the right moment or platform or venue. And the best story told in the wrong context really falls flat. It doesn't live up to its full purpose. So know that you might be tempted to go somewhere, but trust your gut and be like, this just isn't the right platform. This isn't the right moment. This could be so powerful in another context. A good example, I was just thinking about this week. Sometimes you'll see an amazing TED Talk. They're so popular these days, and it can be extremely moving and powerful. You might even cry. But if you booked that speaker to come speak at like your corporate event, it might not be the right context to tell that incredibly powerful, moving story that shifted millions of folks online, right? It really is important to like match the message to the medium and make sure that like you are keeping in context of what people expected when they signed up. It's always wonderful to surprise and delight people with something more than they expected, but it can go the wrong way, especially if you get deeply into people's emotions or vulnerabilities or human experiences sometimes, are delicate. So that's a time when I would advise not going off script, even if you sense something powerful is there. Maybe it's a great conversation to have off camera, after recording, backstage, or just on a different show or at a different time. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up here with just sort of a final bit of encouragement to trust your gut. I said this a minute ago, but it really is like the best gauge in the moment. If you're in the middle of an interview, you sense something, you're like, should I go off script and ask or not? Trust your gut. Like all the tips I just gave you that were kind of more cerebral, ultimately you just got to trust your gut because it won't lead you astray. And there's kind of a lot of sixth senses we have around people and storytelling. And so pay attention to your gut and it will kind of keep you on the right track. If you're tempted to go off script, there might be an amazing thing there. Trust your gut if it says yes. And if it's like, I don't know, probably hold off. Okay, that's it for today's video. Obviously, if you have questions about this, leave them in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next video.